Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources and the co-founder and editor-at-large of Corporate Board Member Magazine. And we're filming here in the New York studios of the Conference Board. And today we're going to be talking about long-term incentives and the compensation committee challenges related to those incentives. And joining me is sort of our compensation expert. Let me introduce Bob Romanchek, who's a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, TK. Pleasure to be here.
It's nice to have you back. So, tax reform comes out. The president sort of jumbles things up a little bit, and all of a sudden we've got changes that are happening. One of the big things that sort of got affected by this is long-term incentives. Right. You and I have always talked about that's the single largest pay component for top executives. So obviously that means that companies have to, comp committees have to take a step back and take a look at what the impact of those changes are. So when you looked at it and saw the changes that were made, what were the changes that were going to be necessary in sort of long-term design, comp design?
Yeah, so coming right out of tax reform, there are a couple things that I think are going to happen there. One, clearly because of the tax rate differences, corporate tax rates are lower. So deductions for companies are worth less, if that makes sense. Not quite half, but a significant amount. And because of that, companies might be more willing to give up or defer a tax deduction if their executives then could give up or defer paying income at ordinary income rates, which are higher for executives. And because of that, I think you're going to see two things because of tax reform in that regard. Number one, deferred compensation plans. They've been out there, voluntary bonus deferral, for example, for a very long time. It's been quiet in that area since we got the 409AG deferred comp rules a number of years ago. And there's additional risk. Those are unsecured general asset promises. Although most organizations have those plans, they're not highly utilized. So now with tax rates for executives staying about the same, net-wise, they may actually end up being a little higher depending on your circumstance. Yet the deduction that's deferred for the company, it could be that companies are more willing to add additional credits. Deferred comp might go up a little bit, but I don't see that being something very significant. The one area, though, there could be some interest is with stock options. So my favorite vehicle, well, of course, they've waned and decreased in usage and depth of the organization. However, there is something called an incentive stock option. You might recall from many years ago. Right now, everybody's using non-qualified stock options, and not to get too deep in taxation, but the exercise of a non-qualified option is an income taxable event to the individual. So that's ordinary income, the spread or appreciation, and the company gets a matching income tax deduction at that time. Now, incentive stock options, a very old vehicle under 422 of the tax code, when you exercise an incentive stock option, it's not an income taxable event. Thereby, the company doesn't get a tax deduction either. So they're pushing that off or foregoing the deduction in exchange for the executive not having income. There's some alternative minimum tax implications, but that's beyond our few minutes here to talk about that. So incentive stock options actually, as a direct result of tax reform, would really come back big with one exception. It's a very important exception. Under the tax reform, the tax code rules, the old rules under section 422, there's a limit. There's a $100,000 vested value limit per year that you can grant in options. So if you grant $300,000 of vested options today as a 3-year vesting period, or $100,000 a year, you filled up those 3-year buckets and maxed out. So you can't grant more ISOs that vest in those 3 years. So that limit really impacts everything, and most companies don't use them now. It's very small, 3%. If Congress were to eliminate that or raise that limit, I do think incentive stock options would come roaring back. It would be the vehicle of choice. I don't see any reason why they're going to eliminate it, but it's something at least to keep in mind. And depending on how much you use options, many organizations now, if they're using it's a quarter, 20% of the total long-term value. For some roles or some levels, it might make sense to try to use incentive stock options instead of non-qualified.
So it's a good segue into when you sit there and look into your crystal ball and say, okay, what is going to be the impact going forward with tax reform? What sort of comes to mind?
Right. So look forward 2018, 2019 with long-term incentives. So an interesting thing has happened here, and that is performance-based vehicles are now the majority. So if you look at top executives, top organizations, the regular cycle long-term incentive grant, 55 to 60% of that economic value every year is in performance-based vehicles. And by far the greatest vehicle now are performance shares, not units. Units are really a cash plan stretched out, but performance shares, mostly those are 3-year cycles where you set performance goals at the beginning of a 3-year period. It's denoted in stock and it's paid out in stock. And the beauty of that, then you've got a double incentive. If you hit goals, just like a bonus plan, you could double the payout. 200% is a typical maximum. However, if you perform poorly, you might get only 50% of target or 0. So it truly is performance, but the underlying vehicle itself, because that stock, if you perform well, the value will go up. So you could get double the shares at higher value. So there's pretty good value and clear performance, pay for performance relationship. So that's now become approaching 60% of the economic value. We still see restricted stock, the traditional retention device, being used by many organizations. Matter of fact, the combination of performance shares and restricted stock or restricted units, that is the most common vehicle if you look at prevalence out there now. And then stock options are still used as well, maybe about half of the organizations. So either they have 2 or 3 vehicles simultaneous, but the action really is in that performance share vehicle. What happened, if you look back 2008 or so with the financial crisis, there's no visibility at all, even for annual bonus plans. So to set a 3-year financial gap type goal was very difficult. That, in addition to some of the proxy advisory firms, ISS coming out with their pay for performance top line quantitative tests based on TSR, both because TSR, you don't have to set a goal, the market does it for you. Both of those items really pushed organizations into using TSR, relative. And so we got to a point, last year or so, where not only is plus 50% of the long-term value in performance shares, more than 50% of that value was in relative TSR type programs. And so for a while that worked, but now you think of the volatility we have in the stock market. So you mentioned the largest, biggest pay component. Imagine if you were the executive and I was going to say, here's a share, and the payout is dependent on our stock price relative to these other 25 companies that we really don't have anything to do with. That's your biggest payout. And there's some squirrely results now that companies are 3-4 periods out and getting payout, and they're not matching their performance necessarily. So because of that, some things are happening, and this is what I see the biggest difference going forward. And it's number one, although all of that for many organizations, the entire 50-60% of long-term value being in TSR plans, that's changed. So more than 70% of companies now have split it in half. So of that 50-60%, half of it now is relative TSR. The other half, they've gone back to more of a gap earnings type measure, earnings per share, growth over a 3-year period, or return measure, depending on how capital intense you are, return on asset, return on invested capital, or both of those. So they're splitting the performance up so they get the balance between the internal numbers that they're using for strategy and budgeting versus the external connection to share price. So that's one thing that's happening. So the value being granted in TSR type performance shares is decreasing. And then secondly, and I think this is where all the action is, organizations are starting to move to using TSR only as a modifier, not as the baseline goal. So in other words, you use 3-year earnings per share growth goals over the 3-year period. You measure that, you come up with, say, a little bit above target. Then you overlay TSR, compare to your index or a peer group, find out how you match up, and that results in a modification to your payout. Typical modifications are anywhere between 15 and 25% plus or minus. So it could help you or hurt you. Yet the way you design that payout curve, it could really have no or very little impact except at the extremes or you could have every little tick above or below the median performance of the index be meaningful. But you can see it's limited. It's not identifying the baseline payout. So you've got the baseline financial payout determining the goal or the payout, but then you get the connection to share performance and the shareholder alignment by doing the modification. There's been a very quick, over the last 18 months, move to that, and I think that's going to continue to rise. And I think more organizations are going to be moving away from using TSR as a baseline measure.
Well, I hope logic prevails, and that does sound more logical when you don't have the squirrely factors in there related to the market. The way I see it, Bob, that probably has lengthened the proxy and the cDNA.
Absolutely correct.
With the changes, and that's something we don't need, is lengthening those. So I want to thank you. Some great advice and knowledge here. I want to thank you for taking the time for joining us. That will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.